I think that we aren't used to coalitionary government in Britain, and so therefore we judge Nick Clegg by the kind of criterion that we would judge somebody who had an overall majority. And in those countries, and of course this may actually be a problem for Nick Clegg in the sense that of course he's got a background in Europe, so he's used to countries, he's used to coalitionary politics, but we're not in Britain. And so we look at Nick Clegg's manifesto and say, why haven't you carried out your manifesto? Well, actually in Europe, where they're used to this kind of government, they'd say, well, manifestos are just kind of symbolic statements. Nobody expects to carry out their manifesto because everyone knows this is kind of coalitionary government which involves horse trading. So I think part of the stick that Nick Clegg gets is because we are in Britain are not used to the idea of coalition government. In relation to the coalition as a whole, I have to say I'm kind of pretty disappointed in the quality of decision making that we're seeing. What is not clear to me is what that is about. Is it coalition, which is, I think, if you talk to people in government, in the Conservatives, they will say that coalition government is very difficult. You have to have two advisors on every issue and these kinds of things. Is it just austerity? Is it simply that when you've got no money, it's very, very hard to make the right decisions? Or is it a kind of ideology which is opposed to the very notion of coherence and clarity, which kind of thinks, well, policy coherence, that requires policy coordination, that requires planning. Hang on, this is all sounding a bit statist. And so there's almost a kind of glorying in the fact that we have police commissioners, but we won't have education commissioners for no apparent kind of reason, for example. So I don't think this is a terribly, especially as it's still quite a young government, it's not a terribly convincing government in terms of the quality of decision making, but it's quite difficult to put your finger on quite why that is. I think the coalition will stay formally together, but it will increasingly speak in different directions. And we've already seen in the last couple of weeks, David Cameron, I think it's a very interesting phenomenon really, David Cameron starting to talk about what will go in the next Conservative manifesto. And that is, it's slightly odd when you're not even halfway through your term to be starting to fly kites about what you're going to do in your second term. But I think this is kind of partly necessary because David Cameron needs to reassure his own side that in the end he's going to stand very clearly for a Conservative majority at the next election. So, expect Nick Clegg also to be making speeches about what will be in the Lib Dem manifesto. So the way that these two leaders are dealing with the fact that they have to compromise day to day is talking about the golden day when they won't have to compromise anymore. And as we get closer to the election, you'll hear more of that second kind of conversation, what we would do if we had power, and less of the kind of first conversation, which is what we have to do now because we're in coalition. I mean, my view is that the big society should be seen as actually in some ways continuous with an emphasis that Labour developed, which was on what they call behaviour change. So the big society and behaviour change are both about the same thing really. They're both about how is it you encourage people to do the things they need to do to deliver the kind of future that we say that we want, given that the state can't do that. Now, so I was a supporter of the big society idea because I think it was in that right space. It was saying to us, look, actually, a better future is about citizens and what they do. It's not just about government and government policy. I think the problem has been, on the one hand, of course, austerity. And I think even the most zealous Conservative now no longer would assert that you simply have to withdraw the state for civil society to flourish. I mean, that might happen in very, very affluent areas, but there wasn't much state there in the first place. But it doesn't happen in poorer areas. But I also think that David Cameron was never really able to convince the rest of government of the big society and to take it particularly seriously. It was interpreted in different ways in different departments. And basically what secretaries of state did, in as much as they cared about it at all, was they looked down the list of policies they were going to pursue anyway and said, oh, we'll describe that as a big society policy. So Whitehall was not bought into it. So there are still fragments of it. You look at the enthusiasm for mutualism, for example, that Francis Maude still talks about. So I think it would be wrong to say that whole agenda has gone, but it hasn't been the kind of sea change in the kind of technology of governance which David Cameron seemed to be talking about at the outset. I think there's something rather odd here, which is what Labour did pretty well on was lifting children out of absolute poverty, but they did less well on lifting on inequality, because inequality is measured in relation to the rest of society, and inequality was widening as a consequence, or it was at best stable because although Labour was redistributive in terms of what it did, the wider economic forces in the labour market and the wider economy were driving inequality. I suspect now that what will happen under the coalition is that the numbers in absolute poverty may well increase, but actually relative inequality might reduce, simply because it tends to be the case that when an economy is in a recession, inequality shrinks, because the people at the bottom, there's not much further for them to drop, whereas the people in the middle and the top, there is quite a long way for them to come down. So if there's a general shifting down in the economy, actually inequality. So you can get the irony, which is that Labour was good on absolute, but measured itself by relative. This is the government says it doesn't think it should measure equality in relative terms. Actually, it might do better on that than it will on absolute terms.